Hello everyone, welcome to Asia and Pacific shows. In this episode, I am joined by Professor Joel Atkinson. We are going to discuss one of the most important part of the planet Earth, Northeast Asia, and its role in multipolar world order, or whether bilateral or unilateral world order. It is implications, what kind of the implications or affects Northeast Asian as a political geography or geopolitical geography has effect, especially in the past century or in 21st century, because it holds some important countries here like North Korea, South Korea. We have the Korean War in the history, and also the technological and economical developments of Japan during the 1990s, and today the economic developments of China and the US-China competition more recently. And historically, these countries divided, especially from the Soviet Union, like the Vietnam divided into two parts and later unified. And today we have the China and the Taiwan. They are divided into two geographical space, and South Korea and North Korea. All these questions I'm asking my guest, Professor Joel, and we will discuss on this conversation. Before we jump to my conversation and questions, let me introduce my guest, Professor Joel, to you. Professor Joel Atkinson is a professor with the Graduate School of International and Area Studies at Hong Kong University of Foreign Studies, Seoul, where he researches and teaches East Asia international relations and the politics of foreign aid. He received his PhD from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, where he also taught for several years. He also worked as a research fellow at the Institute for Poverty Alleviation and International Development at Yonsei University. His research has been published in the Pacific Review, Pacific Affairs, Development Policy Review, the Australian Journal of International Affairs, and elsewhere. Welcome, Professor Joe. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Lokman. It's great to be having this conversation with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Joe. Let me start with the historical legacy of the Northeast Asian region. So, as a scholar, how do you see the historical power dynamics and unresolved territorial disputes within Northeast Asia influence the region's role and its role, especially in multipolar world order? If you agree, we are in multipolar world.
Yeah, well, I guess I could quickly start just in terms of multipolar. I guess to me that term means that we're at this moment where the power gap between the US and China is smaller than it's ever been, and at the same time we still have countries like Japan, which are not rising, but they certainly still have a large kind of composite national strength. And then you have or Russia in that category as well. And then you have India, which you could also class as one of these kind of rising poles. And so within there, countries have to make choices, I think, between whether they're going to bandwagon with that rising pole, China, or whether they're going to balance it in concert with the other poles. And they have to choose their friends and enemies from among, whoever's available. And I think history shapes a lot of those decisions. So, for historical reasons, Japan's kind of alignment with the US in a balancing coalition against China is pretty well, that doesn't require Japan to do anything different or new. Maybe it's got to put in more effort than it used to. Maybe it requires a bit more kind of focus on the military aspects. Whereas a switch to, bandwagoning with China, that would be a major fundamental switch in Japan's kind of post-World War II trajectory. So even there, it's an easier fit for Japan to say, well, we're going to be balancing China. We're going to be working with the US to try to keep things more or less the way they are, maintain the status quo because, you know, we like that status quo more than this future that we fear China is trying to build. And then South Korea, within there, it's a little bit more complicated, and the historical disputes play a big part in that, especially with Japan. Obviously, Korea was a former colony of Japan, and those historical issues kind of really resonate emotionally. And for South Korea to look out at the world and say, well, you know, we've got this growing pressure from China. We fear this kind of that pole, that rise in China. So we've got to reach out and do some external balancing and maybe strengthen cooperation with Japan. For South Korea, that's a difficult choice to make because it means really giving up some, you know, very key, or at least finding new ways to think about Korean identity and the way Korea kind of fits in the world. So it's not, on the other hand, there's also the historical issues with China. And, you know, China, for much of Korea's history, China had a lot of influence on what happens in Korea. And it's a little bit controversial, the words you choose to describe it, but, you know, the Chinese will describe Joseon or the earlier Korean kind of kingdoms as tributary states. And Koreans are sensitive to that. If a rising China means China is going to try to reassert that historical role, and also within China's kind of political historiography, I guess you could call it, there's Koreans see that as in some ways undermining not just Korea's status, but kind of Korea's integrity as a kind of a national unit. So they will, you know, not so much the government necessarily, but just netizens in China will talk about Korean, or there's kind of a bit of chauvinism behind it, where there's this kind of narrative that Korea's culture is derivative of China, and Korea's not kind of, it doesn't have the right, I guess you could say, it doesn't have the status to stand up before what China's trying to do. And there's also then some historical territorial issues, which some Koreans look at China kind of laying the groundwork for asserting control over North Korea if North Korea collapsed. So there's history on both sides of it. And up until now, you definitely, from the view from Beijing, when they're looking out, is that history is very much an asset when they're trying to encourage South Korea to bandwagon rather than balance. And they'll see that there's history issues with Japan are very much you know, an impediment to greater kind of triangular cooperation between Japan, South Korea, and the US. And you do see the US trying very hard to kind of push them together. So, but that's, I don't, in recent years, it's kind of flipped. And those Japan issues haven't gone away, and they're still very powerful. They still really resonate with people. But then these cultural issues with China, and also that kind of resonance with that historical kind of chauvinism, and which has combined with the more recent behavior that we've seen from the Chinese government from the Korean perspective. So I mean, it's kind of a bit more balanced. And I think those history issues are still, you know, kind of pulling Korea apart, pulling Korea in two different directions, but less and less, I think, of an impediment to, you know, kind of swallowing, you know, there's a bit of a distasteful, kind of pushing those distasteful feelings aside and kind of getting to more pragmatic, practical cooperation with Japan, even if that means, you know, not always holding Japan to account for what Koreans would see as its kind of historical misdoings. So yeah, it's a complicated picture historically, And those issues are not separate from what's going on today, how people kind of think about them and remember them and their kind of political importance. And for Korea, it's kind of, if there's a choice, if Korea is kind of put in a position where it's either going to be bandwagoning with China or balancing against it, then history provides the rationale or the legitimacy of those choices. So those in Korea who don't want to see Korea lined up with Japan and the US, then their focus is going to be on Japan's illegitimacy as a partner for those historical reasons. And then on the other side, those Koreans who want to see, don't want to line up on that side with China, Russia, North Korea, then they will see China's history as kind of showing its illegitimacy as a bandwagoning partner.
Professor Joel, about the economic ascendancy of the Northeast Asian countries, do you believe that to what extent these countries, especially the China or before Japan and nowadays the South Korea or Taiwan, has contributed to the global power structure and the transition to the multipolar world order? What is the role of economy in the transition process?
Yeah, well, I think economy is, like most of the story, really. If we think of what this multipolar world means, is that power gap has closed between the US and China. Militarily, there's still a very large gap. And militarily, the US can do things which China cannot do. The US is kind of a global superpower, whereas China may be, they describe it as approaching the ability to regionally balance the US here in China's backyard, but China cannot project power around the globe. And just in terms of military technology and the experience in using these systems in a complicated kind of combined way, then really there's no comparison between what China can do and the US can do. But then when you talk about economics, even though the US is a far richer country than China, and with all of that implies about productivity and all of those things, the reality is China can produce things in, like a staggering quantity, and not poor quality either. Like they're just incredible productive power. And this is why we're kind of having this conversation. It's not necessarily, it's not just military, it's the fact that China can build ships of not as good as the Americans can do, but good enough. And they can build missiles, and they might not be as good as what the Americans can do, but they're good enough. Whereas the US may have these exquisite capabilities, but as we can see with Ukraine and now with Israel, it kind of lacks that industrial capacity to carry it on in a sustained way. So economics is more, it's a large part of why we're even talking about this. And then also the transition that's going on is, this, China didn't rise in isolation. It rose in deep integration with not only the US economy as a market and a source of investment and technology and expertise, but also integrated with the US's alliance partners and also Taiwan. So within that kind of US security umbrella, that's when this kind of East Asian production network was formed. And yeah, it's the different, the Japan will produce, some component, Korea will produce some component, Taiwan will produce some component, and they'll be sent to China and put together with some Chinese components and Chinese labor, and then sent off to the US, where the, for US consumers. So this was working well for everybody. It worked well for China in helping China raise its living standards, and it worked well with countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, who also developed on a similar model and found it very hard to transition to being more of a post-industrial consumer society like the US or some other Western countries. So they found it much easier. Then they could stay industrialized, stay focused on exports, but do it in cooperation with China and benefit from China's economies of scale, and then also look forward to a future where China will also be a large market for Korean and Japanese and Taiwanese exports. So the situation we have now is all of that's still in place, and the Americans are still absolutely crucial for the whole system to work, because if China produces far more than it can consume, and if the Americans weren't there to play the opposite role, then China couldn't keep kind of specializing in production in that way. So it's the effects of that are very complicated, because it means there's real cost to Korea, Taiwan, and Japan from decoupling or even de-risking, especially if China kind of punishes that behavior to discourage them from doing it. But at the same time, the US plays this key role in being kind of underpinning this whole system with its demand, and also US inputs in terms of technology is crucial for the whole thing as well. So you can see that best with semiconductors, where China was on track to, in many ways, catching up with what South Korean and Taiwanese companies can do, but at the same time not knowing what they can really do to stop that, because it's so hard to kind of break out of that economic relationship, and it would put too much burden on their economies. So they're more or less carrying on, hoping for something to happen. And then now with the US focusing on that as a strategic kind of security issue, as a military issue, and then they're saying, all right, we're going to try to restrict China's access to those most advanced chips and the machinery to build them. And because the US has basically plays that key role in technology in driving that whole system, and because also they play the key role as the market where those chips are going to end up, they have a lot of leverage over South Korea and Taiwan and Japan to restrict their cooperation. But at the same time, there's limits to how far they want to go with that, because that can put costs on American companies as well, and also their allies complain about it. So there's this really complicated process going on where that old way of doing things and all of those old assumptions that this is just the way it's going to be forever has now gone, and everyone knows that we're transitioning to a new kind of economic arrangement. But all sides are still deeply entangled with each other, but at the same time there's this added security aspect to it, which is kind of pushing towards more de-risking or more decoupling. But at the same time, there's also those inertia and just those forces, economic forces, and just the kind of economic rationale that also just wants to keep things.
Apologize. I think there is a technical issues. I'm going to, my questions will be about the regional security architecture. How can a multipolar world accommodate the security concerns of Northeast Asian states, considering the presence of nuclear powers and ongoing regional tensions? Especially, we have, I think, 3 nuclear countries in the region, like the China, North Korea, and at the upper north, Russia also has border. What will be this effect of the nuclear weapons and the security architecture to the multipolar world order?
Yeah, well, I think it has a very profound effect in terms of the presence of nuclear weapons, I think, makes the consequences of World War III that much more scary. So in some ways that can act as a deterrent or restraint, but also I think people are maybe can kind of underestimate the risks of war because they believe that nuclear weapons have kind of taken that off the table. And there's a lot of these nuclear issues are very much tied up with all kinds of other issues. There's quite a lot of discussion in South Korea at the moment about whether South Korea should develop its own an independent nuclear deterrent, or whether it should host American weapons. And yeah, I think those things will continue to grow, especially if Trump is re-elected, and just longer term, if there's growing questions about the US's kind of commitment to South Korean security. So those pressures are there, but I'm pretty skeptical that given South Korea's kind of polarization, I can't really see a pathway where there could be that bipartisan, that kind of necessary bipartisan stable consensus where the country as a whole could agree that they should go through all of the, not just the expense, but the international backlash and the pressure from the Americans or China or North Korea or wherever to actually go through right to the end where they actually have nuclear weapons. I'm less familiar with the debate in Japan, but I think there's less of this same urgency behind this kind of debate about nuclear weapons. But I don't expect Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan to actually be developing nuclear weapons, which means that it really comes down to American credibility with its nuclear umbrella. And here it's, there's a lot that we should be worried about. I think if you look at North Korea, to me, they seem more confident than they've been in a long time. And they really do seem confident that having the kind of nuclear weapons necessary to keep the Americans out, and also the tactical nuclear weapons needed to kind of, correct the imbalance between South Korea's more sophisticated technology. So they really are confident that their kind of coercive power that they can then use to push for their desired political outcomes has gone up a lot. And yeah, and South Koreans very sensitive to that new coercive power, and they're trying to bring the Americans in to show a greater commitment with their nuclear umbrella. And the Biden administration has been kind of working towards meeting the Yoon administration halfway like that. But there's still a big question mark over how committed the US would be to South Korean security if it meant losing Los Angeles or whatever. And then with Taiwan, there's for a long time the Chinese were telling the story, and a lot of Western experts were going along with this story that China didn't need a comparable nuclear arsenal to the US. They just wanted to maintain a minimal deterrent. Now it turns out that actually Xi Jinping has made the decision to aim for something like parity with the US. And if you read what the Chinese experts, analysts are saying about this, they do seem to think nuclear weapons are a key part of brinkmanship and negotiating with the Americans. And the more powerful China's nuclear weapon capabilities are, then they can walk with the US up that escalation ladder. And this will be key when it comes to a kind of a showdown over Taiwan, and they're hoping that they can make the Americans kind of blink and take a step back. And yeah, so China's growing nuclear capabilities certainly are changing, or they're certainly entering more into the conversation about the US's commitment to Taiwan and how willing it would be to engage in an active defense of Taiwan. Yeah, so I think this nuclear weapons it's only going to be a bigger and bigger topic. It's certainly not going away, and there's going to be lots of pressure on countries in the region to decide whether they need their own nuclear weapons, or pressure on the Americans to find ways to, like share their nuclear weapons or show more of a nuclear presence. But ultimately, I think, it's part of this multipolarization that you're talking about, where, 10, 20 years ago, the sense of nuclear weapons was they were contributing to that gap between the US and everybody else. And now nuclear weapons are eroding that gap. And North Korea's done they've done an excellent job of overcoming their limitations and closing that kind of coercive gap with the US to a point where, you have Americans who will more and more be voicing doubts that the US can credibly commit to protecting South Korea. So I think nuclear weapons, while they're not new, they're certainly they're a key part of the current dynamic.
Dr. Prof. Joel, we come to the emerging power dynamics. How the middle powers like South Korea will navigate the multipolar landscape, balancing the relations with the major powers and asserting their own interests?
Yes, so South Korea is, like everywhere, it's a complicated place, and there's different kind of views about what Korea is and what it should do. And one popular kind of vision for Korea's future is that it will be through a process of kind of reconciliation and cooperation, greater cooperation with the North, then Korea will move towards more of, if not unification, but some kind of confederation, some cooperative relationship. And at that point, Korea will be kind of proud and independent and autonomous. So the language that the previous president, who was on the left, Moon Jae-in, what he would use is it would be in the midst of the great powers, right? So in that kind of vision, there's not a big difference between the US and China, or US and Russia, or even Russia and Japan. Basically, these are just the great powers. China's South Korea, or this kind of united Korea, is still what the Koreans describe as the shrimp, right? There's a shrimp between the big whales, but it's going to be a powerful shrimp. And with the combined capabilities of North and South Korea, maybe even having North Korea's nuclear weapons, then it will be this proud, autonomous, making its own decisions, friends with everybody, enemies with nobody, kind of like, it's like a pole, right? It'll be a pole within that multipolar world. And China likes that vision, because that means distancing from the US. And who knows, China may think that down the track, South Korea won't actually be able to resist that kind of gravitational pull of China, and it will end up in a more subordinate relationship to China than maybe some Korean nationalists would hope. So there's that vision. So if that's your vision, then the way you're navigating is basically you want to play the big powers off against each other and create the conditions where you can reach some fundamental reconciliation with North Korea. And you want to avoid being entangled, right? If the Americans are trying to pull you into Taiwan, you want to stay out of that. You don't want to make China angry. You want to continue to benefit economically from integrating with China's economy, but also you want to keep exporting to the Americans and have access to American technology. So you just, the vision is we kind of skillfully navigate through and avoid the costs and get all of the benefits. And so that's popular on the left, but on the right, it's not so different. There's a lot of this kind of belief that you can skillfully navigate and get all the good stuff and avoid all the bad stuff and avoid all the entanglements, but also entangle the others in a way that benefits you. And I guess against that, there's more of a vision that Korea can't afford to be neutral, and it's not realistic for Korea to think of itself as a pole. The current president talks about Korea as a pivotal state, a global pivotal state, but also he talks a lot about kind of values, and there's a bit of a contradiction there. But yeah, so the other still kind of fairly minority view, but would be that South Korea, the biggest threat to South Korea is North Korea, and not just in terms of an invasion, but a political domination, like a subordination. And in that, South Korea has to keep the Americans in, and an alliance. Also, China's not South Korea's friend in that process, because they're going to work together with North Korea to subordinate South Korea. So in that case, Korea's got to reach out to potential partners like Japan, but also in the alliance with the US, there has to be more reciprocity. So if we want the Americans to do this, then of course we need to help them when they ask for our support with Ukraine or ask our support to do with Taiwan or whatever. So there's kind of I think a growing sense that Korea's path forward is to join up with that bigger balancing coalition against China and basically stay on overall maximize the economic benefits, because it ends up on the more powerful, richer side of that division. And so that kind of part of Korea is advocating, reaching out to kind of improving relations with Japan, working with the US, even if it creates some friction with China, kind of pushing up against that edge where the Chinese are unhappy, because ultimately, if Korea has to choose, it's going to choose the United States. So, yeah, Korea's sees itself very much kind of caught. It's under pressure. Traditionally, it could rely on China for its economic interests and the US for its security interests. But like we were talking about before, those two things can't be separated. And certainly now they can't be separated. So when it's pushed under that pressure, then two options emerge. Either you rely less on the Americans for security, which means you're going to take your chances with the other side, or you rely less on China for the economics, and which means you've got to pay, you'll pay an economic price for that. So Korea is still, I think, working out what it wants to do. And you have both sides, you'll hear that both opinions, and there's a bit of a zigzag depending on who the president is. But yeah, the overall trend seems to be South Korea kind of coming to the realization that it's not actually possible to stay above it all and get all the good things and avoid all the bad things, that actually some tough choices are involved, and maybe some prices have to be paid, and in which case, even though it's Korea wish it wasn't in that situation, it's better to balance China than to not.
Joel, the United States are playing important role in Northeast Asia, whether we start from the Korean War or from the Vietnam War or its relations with Japan. And how will this evolving role of the United States in the region impact the balance of power and the character of multipolarity in Northeast Asia?
Yeah, well, I think at the moment, the US has a profound role, and that, it has the certain characteristics that mean that it will continue to be playing a very large role. One of those is, it's a superpower. It's got all of that kind of military and economic and technological power behind it, but also it's here in Northeast Asia, but it's also far away. And I think this does two things. One is, yeah, it's true, it makes it harder for the US to kind of project power into the region, but it also means that the US is not, it's not as frightening to its neighbors as China is. And the other part of that is, as a rising power, China, when countries are looking at China, they have to, they're predicting whatever problems they have with China today. If China keeps getting more powerful, then those problems will amplify into the future. Whereas when they're looking at the US, they have the kind of opposite calculation. They say, whatever problems we have with the US today, probably tomorrow those problems will be smaller. And countries have had many problems with the US, but they've found ways to deal with it. They've worked it out. And also, they're just not expecting those problems to get any bigger. So the US is, China will say, why do you keep hyping the China threat? Look at the Americans. They've gone and used military power, caused all of these problems all around the world, which all may be true. But whatever problems you had with the US, tomorrow it's going to be smaller. And whatever problems you have with China, tomorrow it's going to be bigger. So in that calculation, then you have to, if you can't accept China's growing influence over your decision-making, which comes from bandwagoning, if you can't accept that, then you're going to have to find partners who can help you push back. And the US is, it's here, and it's already there, and the kind of institutions are already in place. And it's China's, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen with China economically, but, those people who talk about peak China, it's not crazy to think in that way, that whatever the future holds, China's rise will be slower and it may reverse to a certain extent. On the other hand, the US has certain resilience to it. So, looking at it now, then it's not, there's many, many reasons why countries like South Korea, Japan, or Taiwan would, even though they have their doubts about the US and we don't know what Trump's going to do, but given that the US is already here, given that it's a superpower, and given that, it's not obvious that China is going to be able to grow to a point where it can just push the US out if it wants to. So they're kind of, it's not just a matter of the US kind of, as China rises, the US kind of is trying to push itself more in. There's part of that, but also countries in the region, especially Japan, are working harder to bring the US more into the regional arrangement. Yeah, so I think the US will be playing a very important role. I guess ultimately the most important thing it does is that kind of puts a military limit on what China's willing to try. So you can see that happening now with the Philippines in the South China Sea, whereas that role of the US as a kind of a constraint on what China, how far China would go in using force. And, you know, it may change 10 years from now. Not only is the gap closed, maybe China will just be so much more powerful that the US can't credibly play that role. But at this moment, yeah, countries are still looking for the US to play that role. And yeah, so far the US has kind of been willing to kind of continue and strengthen that role. So I think that, yeah, the US plays a very large role in shaping this kind of dynamics, and that's not going to change in the foreseeable future.
Professor, also the domestic foreign policy and domestic consideration of the Northeast Asian countries playing a crucial role and in its relations with the foreign countries, major powers or regional powers. You know, when we look at the Japan, especially the most recent trilateral agreement between the United States, Korea, and Japan. When you look at the Japan's the news in Japan or in Korea, there is a still, you know, unresolved issue seems to appear on the surface, especially from the Korean War, and the political parties. I think playing another important role. For example, when the leftist parties come to power in South Korea, there is another foreign policy. When the right party come to power, is conservative party come to power, is another the foreign policy approach appear on the surface. And also in Taiwan, when we look at the Taiwan, you know, there is a DPP and Kuomintang. One has good relations with China, and others has relations with the United States. So how this the domestic considerations, domestic policy of these countries affect its foreign policy affairs and its relations with the major powers?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, you're right. It is very crucial. And, you know, when we talk about a multipolar world, maybe we lose track of some of that kind of domestic complexity. Yeah, I think just in terms of Korea and Japan, one of the, you know, both sides see the logic of closer cooperation between the two. But the problem there is that from Japan's point of view, they maybe Kishida's not strong enough, he's not a strong enough leader, maybe doesn't have enough support, but they're not really willing to pay a big price in terms of domestic politics. They're not really willing to go far enough to meet South Korean concerns about history. So if Japan's not really willing, we don't have a leader in Japan who's really willing to bring the whole country behind them in a major effort to really kind of win over the South Korean public. And then part of that also is, I get a sense from Japan that they really don't trust South Korea, and they think that the next president will come in and all of the compromises, all of the concessions they made will then be turned around and they'll get nothing from it, and even they'll end up in a worse position from when they started. So there's kind of willingness to kind of go along with what the South Korean side's done, but not really doing any work to make it a lasting change. And then in South Korea, yeah, the president Yoon is very, I don't know, he kind of makes up his mind about what he thinks it should be, and he's not a good politician in the sense of getting allies together and bringing the country along with him. and he's a former prosecutor, and he kind of acts in that way where basically I'm the boss now, I make the decisions, and then if I say we're going to be more cooperative with Japan, that's what we're going to do. But of course, he's just the president, and hasn't done a good job of bringing the country behind him in doing that. And then that does make it very fragile, because now there've been elections here in Korea, and the president's party did poorly, and then everything else about what he's doing gets tied up together with that. So now it's like, maybe the country, maybe the people don't want to be closer to Japan. Maybe the president is pulling the country in the wrong direction. Maybe the people in Korea want a more independent foreign policy rather than closer cooperation with the US. So all of that really matters. But I think the force, the kind of, like the Deus Ex Machina, or the kind of outside force that plays a role, is China. And China has a big vote in the way these countries end up going. And even if South Korea and Japan can't get their act together, that just growing pressure from China pushes them. And maybe if this president won't do it, the next president won't do it, or the next prime minister. As the pressure just grows, then the country can kind of move in that direction. So I think that kind of power dynamic and the threat, this kind of growing perception of threat, does change domestic politics. So the domestic politics changes how those countries respond to it, but also it's changing the domestic politics. And South Korea has become very, you look at the opinion polls, and China has a very low approval rating in Korea, which is to do with a lot of different things. But all of that provides, kind of pushes politics in a direction where strengthening the alliance with the US, even if that means cooperating with Japan more, becomes politically more of a kind of a winner, and the other side is seen as more of a liability. And I think Taiwan is something similar. You're right, like the KMT is more for putting less conditions on engagement with China, whereas the DPP is more, we will, there's certain things that we won't say, there's certain things that we won't do. Even though we want to have a cooperative relationship with China, there's certain things we won't accept. And, if you think of what China's trying to achieve with Taiwan, is to get them to a point of view, to a point where they accept a one country, two systems. And the KMT knows that, and they know that the people in Taiwan would never vote for that, but they're willing to find some compromise with Beijing and try to fudge that issue so that the economic relationship and all the rest and the tensions can go down, can go on. And the DPP are behind them. They know that that's a vote loser. The KMT can't get elected promising to take Taiwan towards one country, two systems. But also the people in Taiwan, they don't want war, and they don't want the DPP to openly kind of tell Beijing that they'll never get what they want. So, but underneath all of that, the reality is China is getting more powerful. China is getting more insistent. And the people in Taiwan have to make a choice, either, yes, you go one way, you get more cooperation with China, but you're one step closer towards one country, two systems. You go the other way, and China's going to be unhappy with you. And who knows, it could be war, but you're one step further away from one country, two systems. And, in Taiwan, there's a lack of confidence in the Americans and whether they can be kind of relied on to support Taiwan. And so I can understand that, where, if the voters really had their way, they just want to pick a government who can revitalize the economy. They don't want war. They don't want drama with China. they don't want to be pushed in a situation where they have to do things that they don't want to do because the Americans are telling them they have to spend more on defense or have a longer military service. So yeah, like Koreans, they just rather have all the good stuff and avoid all of the bad stuff. But, you know, that doesn't change the fact that, you know, China's getting more powerful. They're closing the gap with the US. The pressure's increasing. And, you know, ultimately, just like countries, those people, the public, they've got to make a choice whether, you know, do you want to bandwagon with China and therefore increase China's ability to make decisions for you? Or are you going to balance and maintain your autonomy, maintain your ability to make your own decisions, but you're going to have to pay a price for that because, you know, balancing is not free. So I think that there's, you know, within all of these countries, there's some who are advocating more of a bandwagon with China, some more of a balancing, and then in the middle, there's people who can, who may be promising that, you know, you can have more of the benefits of bandwagoning without the prices, or you can have more of the benefits of balancing without the price. And so there is this sense politics can switch and, or a lack of, like in Japan's case, just a lack of momentum. But ultimately, you know, if you have a problem with China today, tomorrow it's probably going to be even bigger. And as much as you kind of wish the problem would go away, China's still there and it's still getting more powerful. So then those, the domestic politics, I think, ultimately, yeah, they may complicate it, but they don't really stop this overall slide towards growing balancing in the region.
Prof. Joel, another important part of the domestic politics, I think, should be ideological contestation. When we look at the internal affairs of these countries, how these competing ideologies and values exposed by the major powers in the multipolar world and by within the Northeast Asian region?
Yeah, well, I think about this one a lot, and there's no simple answer, but you know, a lot of people looking at the current situation, they'll make a contrast between the Cold War, where there was that real ideological aspect, and here where China it's not promoting other countries adopt its ideology. But I think ideology is like really fundamental to what we're talking about. And again, if you use the kind of language of multipolarization, which is kind of imagining kind of billiard balls, you kind of lose how those ideas play a big role. And fundamentally, if you think of what China's doing, is in order to maintain internal security, internal legitimacy, the Communist Party is going out into the world to make the world safe for its ideology. And part of that is getting other countries to say, not only is China's system okay, but like it's good. It's like maybe it's better. Maybe it's better than the other systems. And maybe the order, that domestic order inside China, when they reach out to make the external order like that internal order, maybe that's going to be a better world. And so then that means that this brings China into conflict with the US, because they're trying to pull the US down in terms of the prestige of its ideology and in the eyes of the Chinese people. But then also internationally, they want to bring down the prestige or the value that people see in the current system. And to countries on the other side of that who like the current system, this is a threat. So, and this process where the Chinese government's going out in the world to make the world safe for the party. This means reaching into those countries. And there's, you know, a lot of news coming out of Australia. There's a Australian TV show, Four Corners, where they're talking about the, you know, the Chinese Ministry of Public Security, and they send agents around the world to control what dissidents are saying in other countries, and to lure these dissidents to other countries where they can then be arrested and extradited back to China. So there's this process, and you can look at political interference, the relationship with politicians, with the media, with business. All of this reaching into other countries to change them is highly threatening to those countries who want to maintain their decision-making power over their own system, and they want to maintain the world in a way they want it to be. So it brings so other countries, some countries see what China's doing as less threatening. So a good example would be North Korea, because they can, you know, it's a safe bet that if China's kind of calling the shots regionally and globally, that's going to be a world much less hostile to North Korea's system and ideology. Within other countries that are more pluralistic, in South Korea, there'll be some people who say, we are not, you know, what China's creating has a lot of attractive aspects to it. So this kind of ideology of, you know, in the Cold War, it's called national liberation, and this kind of anti-imperialism. A lot of countries want to jump on that bandwagon, or not countries, but individuals within countries say this would be a kind of a more just world. And then on the other side, you have people even within China who say, actually, more of a liberal ideology, the right to free speech, the right to walk around China with a blank piece of paper and not get arrested. Those things are what I want the world to be. So then ideology becomes a key dividing line and a key kind of struggle within, you know, the way this multipolar world is emerging.
Technological innovations. How does the rapid advancement of technology, and particularly in areas like artificial intelligence, affect this power dynamics and strategic competition in Northeast Asia, and it is a multipolar landscape? Because this country is playing an important role when the Taiwan, China, Japan, and South Korea, all these became a power hub of the technology, and they have good relations with the major powers, other part of the world. How these technological innovations will have effect on their relations, foreign policy or domestic affairs?
Yeah, okay. I guess I'll pick up two things. One is just in terms of military power. You know, the US had a really has a very significant lead in terms of traditional technologies. So the US jet engine for their fighter planes is far beyond what Russia can do, let alone what China can do. But one of the impacts of these new technologies is maybe it's not so important that the Americans had the very best submarines and the very best fighter planes. Maybe technology now with drones, AI, it means quantity has a bigger impact. And then that brings in China's industrial capacity. So it can produce, it really threatens, I think, to change that military dynamic where the US's lead in a lot of these kind of military technologies is not as big a determinant of that power gap as it used to be. And then the other part of technology is industrial chains. You know, the big one everyone's talking about right now is electric vehicles and batteries. And China's done a very good job of investing a lot of capacity, a lot in that kind of production capacity and subsidizing that production through a reduction in consumption. So they're kind of using the household sector to support the productive sector. And this, yeah, like I've talked about, it has kind of military implications to it, but also as the economy is changing, then it is kind of shifting a lot of the, China's becoming less reliant on the rest of the world, less reliant on South Korea and Japan and Taiwan for the cutting edge in those kind of manufactured goods. The AI is, you know, this, who knows how fast AI will continue to develop. But it's interesting because that's one where you could make the case that it was only possible in the United States with the kind of institutions and the innovative ecosystems and a kind of a more of an openness made, and also you know, a market allocation of capital makes something like ChatGPT possible, whereas China is still struggling to catch up with those kind of technologies. So there's a bit of a division opening up where China's in many ways dominating in technologies which are, you know, not easy to come up with, but in some ways predictable, like good car batteries, good wind turbines, good solar panels, whereas it's still, the US is leading in terms of technologies we didn't even know that we wanted or didn't know that could be possible. And so I'd certainly put AI in that category. So the big question then is how important AI becomes, and how whether China's way of waiting for these technologies to emerge and then using its, you know, incredible ability to direct resources from other parts of the Chinese economy and direct them into these targeted areas chosen by the government, whether or not in this case that is enough to keep up with the US or surpass the US. So yeah, again, going back to that ideology part of it, it's a kind of one of those key battlegrounds in terms of which ideology better can support, I guess, what you call the well springs of national power, right? Whether it's all about industry or whether actually maybe things like AI will turn out to be more powerful than the ability to produce a lot of stuff.
Prof, unlike the Southeast Asian countries, and you know, the Southeast Asian countries at least succeed to build an institution like ASEAN, but the Northeast Asia is different. Maybe this is the Soviet legacy or US Soviet competitions. So in this regional, you know, can Northeast Asia develop a unique form of multilateral with the broader multipolar world, and even inside with their regional countries, they can go outside, make a unified approach toward the outside as a Northeast Asian countries. Do you believe that Northeast Asian countries will, in the future, can form a kind of multilateral organization, at least like ASEAN?
Yeah, I think China believes it's possible, and you know, when I was talking about those two kind of visions of which South Korea's future will be, those South Koreans who want to see a autonomous, unaligned, kind of proud, unified Korea, that vision could be where there's and you know, so from China's point of view, what that vision requires is Japan has to accept that China plays a leading role. And that means distancing themselves from the US. So if from China's point of view, if Japan can accept a subordinate position to China, and if they distance themselves from the US, and then if Korea is unified or in some kind of confederation, and they've distanced themselves from the US, and Russia is accepted its status as a second-rate power. So it'd be kind of a China-centric multilateralism. I think that's what China hopes to see, and that's possible. It'd be something like ASEAN, I think, is impossible because it kind of implies a certain balance between those involved. Or, you know, I'm not an ASEAN expert, but, you know, if you have your giants like Indonesia, but they're not, they're relatively reserved in their desire to assert their will over the decisions everybody else is making. So you could imagine a future where, with China at the center, the Americans have gone back to Guam or Hawaii, and there's kind of a regional order centered on China and a multilateralism, but with China as the kind of the lead, you know, the most equal of equals. Then yeah, I could imagine that. The current, or you could imagine if, looking 10 years from now, 20 years from now, China has undergone democratization. And I think after that, you know, without Chinese support, North Korea couldn't last long. And if Russia has gone a transformation, then yeah, you would basically, the current structure in place could suddenly become much more cooperative, because countries will fundamentally agree on what the future looks like. So there, I could see that also. You know, I don't know how possible that is. It seems quite unlikely at the moment. But in the current situation where you have countries looking at China and saying, we can't trust them, or we don't want them to get, we cannot trust them getting greater influence over our affairs, so we have to push back. And to the extent those countries still see this as viable, right? As long as the US is still there to lend its weight, as long as India and China are still not, if they're in a growing kind of spiral of tension, and if India's pushing back on China as well, then yeah, those countries wouldn't be in a position where they've got no choice but to accept China's kind of vision of the way that the region should be. Or if the pressure from that coalition is strong enough and China's not necessarily its rise, but its aggrandizement is kept in check, and then yeah, eventually then China's going to change, because you know, nothing stays the same. And if the external order is hostile to, you know, if the external order says, we believe if you want to hold up a blank piece of paper and walk around in your country, that's fine, and arresting those people is wrong. If that's the order that's surrounding China, then you know, eventually I think that's those ideas are very hard to keep out, and then we would move to a more kind of cooperative Asia. So yeah, I can't imagine it's going to happen at the same time countries are thinking about developing nuclear weapons, their own independent nuclear deterrence. Those two things can't really go together. And our current Asia, as we see it right now, is definitely, there's kind of a hardening and a securitization and a de-risking, decoupling. And in that situation, I think, yeah, multilateralism doesn't make sense at the China-Japan level, but then at a lower level in, you know, what they're calling the minilaterals, so AUKUS, or Japan and the Philippines and the US, these things continue to strengthen. China, Russia, North Korea, that continues to strengthen. So there's a lot of lateralism going around, but not at a level where, to me, what you're talking about requires India, China, and Japan to all agree on what the region should be like. And 2024, it's they're a long way from sharing a vision of what Asia should be like.
Professor, from the global governance challenge perspective, initially you said the Northeast Asia and Northeast Asian countries has always playing important role in international relations, whether from the geopolitical point of view, whether from the nuclear weapons or technological and innovation and economic developments. So given the divided approach between these countries of Northeast Asian, how can these states contribute to reshaping and reforming the global governance institutions at the better reflect to the realities of the multipolar world order? What kind of the contribution they can put into the global reform?
Well, I guess, so then I would be relatively pessimistic. I think Northeast Asia is absolutely crucial, and anything around the world you can't really, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but if you take the example of Ukraine, even just in terms of Korea, North Korea has played a key role in supplying Russia with weapons. South Korea has played a key role in supplying artillery shells, and China, it's hard to imagine Russia being able to prevail there without Chinese support for its economy. So at all the big questions, all the big issues, climate change, security in Europe, security in Asia, pandemic preparedness, none of these things will be solved without input from Northeast Asia, particularly China. Again, though, the problem is what that input looks like. Some countries ideologically or in terms of their interests, they say, yes, China's input is the input that we want to see more of. But then you have on the other side countries saying, we don't like that sort of input. We want to see less of that kind of input. So unless you have Japan, China, and India all agreeing on this is what the input should look like, and this is the kind of global institutions we want to see, then nothing's going to happen because they're pulling in different directions. And if you ask Japan and India today, who, especially India, has all kinds of problems with the US, but if you ask them, like, who would you rather be at the top level making decisions, China or the US? And they'll say, despite all of its problems, we wish it was us, but if that's not possible, better the Americans than the Chinese, right? So, so that's just another way of saying if China and the US can't agree on what the world is going to look like, you can't just push the US out and then everyone's going to agree what it's going to look like. If anything, those countries could have even bigger disagreements with China about what the world's going to look like. So I can't imagine any fundamental change in global governance until we move through to the new phase, whatever that looks like. So either China's triumphed over this kind of balancing coalition and other countries have just said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We just have to learn to live with China calls the shots now, or China's been constrained to the point where it's chilling out, it's mellowing, it's saying, we don't have to make decisions in a way which is going to be seen as a threat to others, or make decisions in a way where they're going to be actively resisted by others. yeah, and then you could imagine that the world becomes a more cooperative place. So yeah, you know, looking forward to the next 10, 20 years, yeah, I think my prediction would be things are only going to get worse. The situation's only going to get more intense, and that kind of world we used to live in, where people talk about multilateralism and reforming UN institutions, all of those things will become less and less important when the main focus is basically going to be on which side are you on, what's and you know, key questions of national power and military capabilities, and so there'll be greater cooperation within those opposing sides, but then across the sides, then yeah, you'd have to imagine it's going to get a lot more not necessarily confrontational, but those kind of multilateral fora just more or less irrelevant, just less less relevant to where the decisions are made, and instead the key decisions will be made among you know, between Xi Jinping and Putin. They together will make the key decisions that shape what happens on their side, and then the US, you know, maybe Biden and Modi, what they decide is going to shape what happens on some other part of it. And then, yeah, of course, you'll have countries in the middle who aren't happy with the way the world's turning out, and they wish they would have more of a say. But countries aren't going to be able to give more to what those countries want than they can kind of get back in return in terms of their overall competition. So I can't imagine China's going to, yeah, it's not going to sacrifice its own interests for the sake of making Africa happy or South America happy. There will be a limit to how far it can go in terms of, I don't know, what would you call that? Just passing up its decision making to a higher level of governance. They're going to be very, continue to be very concerned about maintaining their own decision making autonomy.
Prof, regarding the future of the alliance system, how will the existing alliance in the region adapt or be challenged by the dynamic of the multipolar world? You know, not only I'm not talking about only the US alliance system in the region, also the realignment of the US, China, Russia, and North Korea and China, the deepening cooperations between these countries. How specifically in Northeast Asian region, what will be the feature of this the cooperation? For example, you know, if in the next US elections, Trump come to power and remove the US troop from the Korea or in Japan, or higher the cost, or given the other developments like the Ukraine war or the Gazan war, how will it affect the North Korea, China, and Russia's cooperations in the future?
Yeah, there's different theories or different schools of thought about what's going on between North Korea, China, and Russia. And, you know, the kind of mainstream view is there's still a lot of tension there, and China's looking at what Russia's doing with North Korea, and they're a bit anxious that North Korea and Russia are going to get too close together. I'd be a minority view, but I think it's just a lot simpler and has more predictive power just to assume that those countries are aligned and they cooperate. But that doesn't mean that they're idiots. They don't cooperate in ways which are going to be obviously counterproductive. So if they declared an alliance, like a trilateral alliance between Russia, North Korea, and China, it'd be counterproductive because it will draw everybody's attention to their alignment, and they wouldn't have any added benefit to the current situation. So but that cooperation, I think, is only going to increase. And part of what the kind of a limit on China-Russia cooperation was basically, I think, China was asking for more than Russia was willing to give. But in the current situation, Russia's increasingly relying on China, and they're willing to give China more of what it wants. And so the alignment of interests is only strengthening, and the cooperation between the three continues to increase. And then on the other side, yes, if Trump is elected, he may, I'm not so sure, he may demand more money to support US troops in Korea than Korea is willing to accept, or he could pull them out. But I don't know, we'll have to see. And there's different schools of thought about whether Trump is going to be on net tougher on China or softer on China than Biden, because both of them have their mixed, in some aspects, are softer and harder than others. So yeah, Trump's a bit of a wild card. It's hard to predict exactly what he's going to do. But I think overall, just in terms of that pressure from China's growing power, there's still, the Americans aren't returning to isolationism, certainly not in terms of their Asian commitments. It's possible that I think South Koreans tend to think the Americans get more benefit out of their alliance with Korea than Americans think. And Americans think in some ways they're being helping South Korea by having the alliance, whereas South Koreans tend to think the Americans are getting some profit out of that relationship. So that could go really badly, and Koreans may well discover that the Americans just don't, that if Koreans don't want the alliance, if they're not really willing to contribute to it in an equal way, then Americans will be fine redrawing the line and say, okay, that's fine. You're on the outside now, and our line will be Japan and Taiwan. And this would be a huge shift, right? If there'd be a major change and very disruptive for the region. I tend to think probably, things will just more or less muddle on the way they are, and what we're going to see is eventually, there's a growing kind of strengthening of not just the US alliance system, but different connections between the nodes, like Japan, Philippines, Australia, and obviously with India, with Quad. Those things will just continue, and there'll be more put behind it in terms of containment measures or balancing measures. So yeah, with the caveat that Trump is a bit of a wild card, my prediction would be that kind of US alliance system and its partners, that what I would describe as a kind of a China balancing coalition is, that will, despite idiosyncrasies of Trump, that will continue to strengthen. So we'll have these, like I was talking about, more of these opposing camps, and more of a securitization and more of that de-risking or decoupling.
My last questions will be about the long-term stability in the region. So what are the potential challenges and opportunities for the long-term stability and regional order in Northeast Asia, especially within a multipolar world framework?
Yeah, so the opportunities, I think even generally, with some exceptions, most people, most Chinese, I'm assuming most North Koreans, like the fact that there isn't war in Asia. There's not a major, we're not in the middle of a new Asian world war. So I think there's pressure there where countries more or less want to keep things the way they are. They still want to have smartphones, and they still want to go on holidays. They still want to buy things online that are made in China, and the Chinese, still want to play online games. So there's just this inertia, this momentum, just where people just want to have an ordinary life. The worry there is that these things, people are talking about war in a way which was just wasn't the case even a few years ago. And you have Japan taking war very seriously. You have the Americans taking war very seriously. You have India taking war very seriously. So we're in a very dangerous moment. But still, there's just this underlying reality that people just, they may say lots of things, but when it comes down to it, they'd rather just continue to live the life they're living than gamble that things are going to be better once the missiles start flying. So I think that's kind of sets a baseline where people hope for stability, and where the stability ends up coming from, well, from Xi Jinping's point of view, stability will come from when the Americans have accepted their place is on the other side of Pacific, and in Asia, China makes the big decisions, and other countries have accepted that, and then that will be stability. And Xi Jinping will say, well, you still get to have your smartphones, you can still go for your holiday in Thailand, but basically there's in this world, I'll make the big decisions. But I don't think that's likely because of that balancing coalition. Therefore, we get into this great risk of instability. But then, so the stability through that is, China's under a lot of demographic pressure, right? Its population has peaked, the size of its workforce has peaked, it's shrinking, its economy is slowing, and its population is, the demographics are changing, and the young people want different things. So there's, if the longer we can go without some major crisis, then I think, we tend back, it's more likely that we can find some fundamental resolution, or if not that, at least take all the energy out of these big issues, like the status of Taiwan, who controls the South China Sea, should the Korean Peninsula be unified, right? If we, as time goes by, if increases the chance that, as older generations pass away and new ones come up, that people can say, those things aren't important enough to kill people to resolve. And violence is not one of the policy tools we're going to use to change the territorial status quo in Asia. So I think those, that to me would be the most optimistic outcome. I don't think Xi Jinping's vision is realistic. I don't think they can avoid the Thucydides trap and rise to the top and without serious instability getting in between now and that vision. So the best hope then is just this balancing coalition continues to strengthen, some deterrence is regained, and time goes by, and Russians, Chinese, North Koreans, and whoever else realize or remember that there comes a great cost with using violence to achieve your political goals, and much better to take that off the table. And these kind of issues like who gets to control which bit of land is not a priority in the modern world. And then we can return, I think, to more stable Asia, like a lot of people were kind of imagining and hoping, in the 1990s.
Professor Joel, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
You're welcome. I think it came like a important IR class. I'm gonna with international relations students. I think we cover most important aspects of the Northeast Asian region, from the history to the present day.
Yeah, well, thank you for putting up with me. I guess I did get into my IR professor mode a little bit, but it was fun for me at least.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And for audiences, please don't forget to subscribe our channel. See you on the next panel.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.